Thank you very much, Karen. May I invite all of our speakers and panelists to come up? Karen left it at a great point, in terms of what next? Where are the big roles that we can play? But we started off with how has IFPRI contributed to this work. We've evolved to what's looking forward, what are some of the big issues coming up, what are some potential criticisms. One of the questions I might have, if we have time, is to ask our panelists, especially Agnes, where is our big regret? What have we missed? but let me open up to you. Any questions, comments, especially for those of you who were in Beijing and have been following this? Where do you see some of the big accomplishments, and more importantly, looking forward? As Karen pointed out, where do you see the agenda? As usual, give us your name, institution, and then be provocative. I see John. I come to you, John, first, and then I see a hand back there. And please do not be shy. This is IFPRI. You can open here.
Great, thank you, Rajul. I'm John Coonrod with the Hunger Project. And as Karen knows, I've been a total WIA groupie. I've been following her and Emily and around to a million meetings on WIA. And in our community level programs, have tried to develop a community level household survey based version. One thing that we discovered, and I would love your thoughts on this, is WIA is not particularly agricultural, and it might advance the whole thing. Certainly we're using it whether the household is a farming or off-farm income generating family, and those now six distinctions of tracking that's in WIA work perfectly well with all decision making. But anyway, we've sent our paper in on where we've gotten with our community level tool, and we're eager to learn more about how people are doing this at lower costs. We've been using little pad-based data collection things that really has sped things up. But it's still a challenge, it's still expensive. The other thing I would just want to comment on is that feeding that data back to the community as quickly as possible, we've seen it stimulate major community campaigns of action. So seeing data collection as the first customer of it being the community of itself has really made a difference for us. So thank you.
John, hold on to the mic. I have a quick question for you. You asked a very specific question on WIA, but let me ask you a bigger question, coming from where you come. Where do you see, what would you see as the next big area, as Karen pointed out, where do you see investment needed?
Well,
in terms of, for gender research to be
from every aspect of our work, from the gender work, from just political voice and agency, beyond the household is the community. And at the community, as Meyer Buvanik has shown, unless there's a really comprehensive set of services available to women, a really integrated programming approach, extremely poor women don't make it out of poverty. So I think more understanding and more research into women's voice at the community level decision making, accountability for programs, and the impact of having co-located multiple service programs available to women are areas where I know we need more evidence. Because when my colleagues sit down with ministers and we talk about integrated strategies, they go, oh yeah, integrated rural development, been there, done that, doesn't work. Well, it actually did work. But those are some of the areas where I think more research is needed.
Very helpful. And as we hear from John, and as things come to your mind, let us know. There was a hand right behind.
Yeah, sorry, I'm going to come up because I feel weird
so
making a comment from behind the column here. My name's Emily Janock, and I work for CARE. And so I first want to start by thanking Mark for the shout out on the Cultivating Equality report. If people are interested, it's care.org/cultivating equality, and it covers a lot of these issues about climate change and food security and how women are implicated. The bigger question I have is in May, I was in Malawi in a community where we were implementing the Women's Empowerment and Agriculture Index. And it's in a community setting, and exactly as John describes, it was about feeding what we had seen back to the communities. And the women said, wait, hang on, you've got it wrong. We are not looking to have our assets all by ourselves, because what happens when that happens is that then our husband says, you go spend your money and leave my money alone. They're your assets, great, individual level, they're your assets. You don't get to touch my assets anymore either. What we want as tools to think about how as a household we can make decisions together, and all of our assets can be joint assets, and we can be making these decisions as a group. So can we think a little bit, and I'd love to hear the panelists' opinions on how we make this case. We've talked a lot about how gender is not just women, and the sort of, you break the game by saying, well, what we're gonna do is we're just gonna measure down to the individual level. We're not gonna think about the household as a unit that has to work together anymore, whereas we know that there is so much important behavior that happens only when the household works cooperatively. So I'd just love to hear a little bit more about people's opinions on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Am I missing any other hands? Or yes, I see a hand right back there. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lida Andu. I work for the SPRING project. It's a USAID nutrition project. We have adopted IFPRI's agriculture nutrition pathways, and my question would be directed to Agnes. If you have the resources and time, would you plan to do more research on the measurements of the other women's pathways in terms of time and energy burden they spend on agriculture-related activity, and how that would affect the nutrition of their own and also their children? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Why don't I come to the panel for this first round, and I give a hands up. I see several of you in the room. I will come back to you if you don't raise your hand later on to ask, where do you think the next frontier is? But why don't I begin? Agnes, do you want to begin, or do you want to end? Which order? End? Okay, Karen, we begin with you.
I think that the last question, which is what I'll take on, is a really important question. So while I'm a very strong proponent of getting data at the individual level, I agree that it has to be contextualized within any cultural context of the unit within which people live. And there are different notions or definitions of families, or some defined by marriage contracts, others consensual union, extended nuclear, whatever. But you need the individual level information with a bunch of other questions to help contextualize what that unit is. Because ultimately, I agree with you, households, however they're defined, do have to work together. I think from the measurement and the data collection front, that's part of, on the question of assets at least, the issue is understanding much better than we currently do from the data that we have, issues of separation and jointness. And, we've had a lot of debates. Agnes participated in all of them, and more than I have at this point, to, for instance, understand whether you consider an asset that is owned or in the hands of a woman to actually be empowering, when in some cases it may not be if she doesn't have the transaction rights over it. So I think actually getting information on people's, for instance, perception of assets and real ability to control assets is only one piece of it. What household surveys don't currently do well is ask the questions about the decision making. And that's where we have to, I think, is a frontier area of research, decision making and what it means, how decisions are made, how those translate into other types of households. So, the DHS surveys and even the WIA ask questions about, okay, well, let's say this household, this particular asset is in your name. How do you decide about it? Do you make the decision alone, or do you make the decision jointly? And as a researcher, or even as a policymaker, you say, well, if you make the decision alone, is it empowering? Not necessarily. You may be making it alone because you may be a sole member of a household and you're left with making it alone, or there's any number of determinants behind that. If you make the decision jointly, that may be much better for women as well as for men. But again, you need to know a little bit more about the process that underlies that. And I'm not sure that on this domain, and maybe Agnes will disagree with me, so I'll put it out here. on the issue of decision making, we're at the point where we have enough information, enough data to make policy recommendations for what we do with this. So at least I don't feel confident enough on this side. So I think this is, again, a frontier area of research. I'm not sure we're going to find a one-size-fits-all answer. We'll probably find a lot of different things depending on context going forward. But I do think we need to understand and begin to unpack the intra-household decision-making that goes along with these really important resources.
Thank you, Karen. Claudia, do you want to come in on any aspect? Okay, Mark, at this time.
Yeah, well, just for John, I'll send you the link to the report we used for WIA, and you can see how we used it. And then on the question from my CARE colleague inviting us to share our opinions, always dangerous with me. I have lots of opinions, but you know, thinking back to when I was at IFPRI and interviewing male and female farmers in Ethiopia, the official policy was in a married couple household, the man is the head of the household, the extension agent talks to the man. They modified that a little bit. Okay, we have the women's extension package, but still, the man is presumed. But talking to actual farmers, well, do you make this decision by yourself? Do you consult your wife? Does your husband impose everything on you? Do you, it seemed more complicated, you know, so, well, actually, so we got a loan, and my husband wanted to spend it on clothes, and I said, maybe we should spend it on something that's, you know, has a return, like better seeds or something. So it seems like some of the households actually do have this feeling of jointness and discuss things. And, you know, I think particularly, again, speaking of Ethiopia, in Tigray, where older women were leaders in the revolution, it's like, you know, well, I still have my Kalashnikov, so nobody pushes me around.
On that note, Agnes?
I don't have a Kalashnikov. These are all really interesting and provocative questions. I think I'm going to go backwards. So I'll start with a question on, are we going to try to look at the other agriculture and nutrition pathways? The answer is yes. I mean, there is a whole research program on agriculture for nutrition and health. Shout out to A4NH, which is trying to look at the other gendered pathways. So there are ongoing research programs looking at that. With respect to the Malawi, the question from Malawi, I think you are perfectly right that, and I actually agree with both of you that you need to contextualize decision making. In some cases, it's more important for a woman to have decision making over a joint asset or to be part owner of a joint asset, which is a major asset like land or large livestock, than for her to be a sole owner of a puny asset, a frying pan, you know, whatever. So I think, and we have in fact seen this in our work when we're trying to evaluate the impact of these agricultural development projects, that many of the increases in asset ownership are in the jointly held assets. And I think it's because both the husband and the wife have a stake in this jointly owned asset. But traditional ways of collecting data, the very traditional way which only says, oh, everything is jointly owned, or the ones which only allow for male or female ownership without a category of joint ownership, sort of miss the point. So I think you have to allow for both individual and joint ownership. But with the understanding that the idea of what is joint is a very amorphous idea, it's a very culturally grounded. When we were designing the modules to look at the inter-household impact of a targeted asset transfer program in Bangladesh, BRAC's very famous Targeting the Ultra-Poor program, one of our advisory committee members said, you have to do qualitative work first. You have to understand what does asset ownership mean in that context. What does it mean for an asset to be owned by a man, by a woman? What does it mean for the asset to belong to the household? And I think that was very important in the way we formulated our research strategy. John, I really agree that the community is a new frontier. I mean, there have been generations of work, for example, on gender-based violence, which have attempted to reach the woman, no effect on gender-based violence, maybe tried to reach men. I'm not sure whether it's done anything, but we're trying these efforts now, which is to do some community mediation, trying to change the norms around the community. Because if you don't change norms, they, it's very hard for behavior to move. It has to happen at the same time.
Thank you, Agnes.
Oh, Rajul, may I say one thing?
Yeah.
I forgot to mention that there are some really beautiful postcards outside, which you can take as your souvenir from this trip. And if you look at the back, there's a QR code if you like that. Or you can just use the website there to look at a link to a series of blogs which summarizes IFPRI's gender research over the last 20 years with links to original papers.
Thank you very much. And I should also mention all the PowerPoints will be up on the web afterwards. So Claudia's list of resources will be easily accessible. Any questions, comments, suggestions? And if not, I would also have one or two questions myself, but I don't want to. Joyce, don't be shy. Simone, Joyce is right there. Yeah.
Good afternoon. I'm Joyce Cacho, independent consultant with Adenura Advisory. Really fascinating, and truth be known, I was doing the analysis on the Living Standards Measurement Survey data at the World Bank for their papers that they took to Beijing. And if you go to school long enough, you start understanding your own life. When the microeconomics of the household came out that disaggregated by gender, I said, oh, this is what's happening in the household that I grew up in. This is what was happening in my grandparents' household. So I now have the theory behind what I had observed. I hear in this discussion the word assets. And in Karen's finishing up and looking forward, I haven't heard the change of the context from 20 years ago. The private sector was not a stakeholder 20 years ago. Certainly not in the development room. And now 20 years hence, there are fewer resources and different motivations that we hear this PPP being talked about a whole lot more. And the private sector has come to appreciate that assets are not things only. And I think that when we talk about the importance of big data, data gathering, evidence-based, my question really is how are we approaching this coming together of the public and the private, the acknowledgement that the private actually is leading on valuing intangibles, and what is a wonderful organization such as IFPRI and development partners such as CARE, USAID, Hunger Project doing about women's assets that go beyond the tangible, community assets that are not tangible. And it's critical because if we don't move ahead and figure out that investment capital starts from those same women and men that have assets that are not tangible, then we're going to fire the arrow and miss the target. So let me not just say that. I encourage in looking into the trend of integrated reporting. This goes beyond the Global Reporting Initiative. And how can we take from integrated reporting in a research community, meld between what the business school is facing and what the social sciences schools are facing? Thank you.
Joyce, thank you very much. I'd like to pick on that for one moment, and I'll give my final questions and comments to both Claudia and Agnes, and then we ask them to wrap up. Claudia, you heard also basically the private sector, and you yourself had provocatively titled your presentation Value Proposition. And so I too have a question in a sense of how do we find a way to bring the private sector into this discourse, and especially around, but not only limited obviously to Paris and COP21, but they are a major player. Do we know how to talk with them? Do we know how to bring them in? And what would you want to see happening? And Agnes, I do come back to my question that 20 years of gender research. Two questions. Do you feel we missed major opportunities? And I don't mean you as personally, but we as a gender research community. And B, do you feel that the gender research community itself has taken wing? And again, I don't mean IFPRI, I mean globally. Or how, where would you want for the gender, what would you ask to the world for the gender research community to be able to flourish the way you think it should 20 years later? And Claudia, we begin with you.
Thanks. Yeah, maybe, I think very, very appropriate comment, because definitely the private sector is now present everywhere, including, in developing climate smart practices, technologies. I can talk a little bit about the irrigation side because I work a lot on irrigation. And my colleague Bruce Meinzendick is managing a project on how to improve public-private partnerships in irrigation development in Africa, because it's a very big topic. There's a lot of hopes, there's also a lot of fears, and there's a lot of black holes, because there's a lot of misunderstandings, and as you say, the main investors and the main people affected, who are the men and women farmers, are generally left out of the discussions. It's generally a discussion between the government, who has some clear expectations on money on the table, and the government, the private sector, with some clear expectations of returns on investment. And so we are actually trying to identify some kind of toolkit on how all parties involved, and including men and women farmers, can benefit from this private sector involvement. That is certainly needed, because we say there is enough money is out there, but somehow it doesn't really reach a lot of resource poor farmers. So that's on the PPP side. So there is some work going on, and obviously more work is needed. On the general, is the private sector ready to understand women farmers' needs on agricultural technology adoption side, on climate smart practice adoption side? I think there's a very long way to go. I think you have pointed it out. The technologies that we're talking about, the agricultural technologies, are not gender differentiated. There's also not yet gender differentiated means to reach women and men. But I think some of the knowledge now has been generated on how to do it. And I believe, as you say, we have not yet sufficiently shown the value in doing so. I think we are moving towards, so this is like one presentation, there's others out there, and there's a lot of people working on that. And Patty Christiansen, for example, is in the room and has been working tirelessly on that as well. So we are starting to make the case, but I have not yet seen a dramatic shift in private sector investors in ag technologies to take this on board, and actually also, as you say, to work with the information channels that women farmers actually do access. So I haven't seen the shift yet, but I believe, because I strongly believe there's value, there is money to be made in reaching both women and men farmers, so the shift will happen because the return for research is there. But I haven't seen it yet. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. I'd like to give Agnes the final words. So before I do that, Karen and Mark, any final comments from your side? Karen first and then Mark.
I just want to say that I actually think one of the agendas that is really important is actually having the private sector reveal data. At the IFC, which is part of the World Bank, we have a big initiative with the Global Banking Alliance on women, and it's actually having banks reveal sex disaggregated information on their borrowers and the performance of those borrowers. And it's really tough because of proprietary issues, but also because of competitive purposes and so forth, getting that kind of data. But it's really, really critical. And we're starting to work with central banks, for instance, to get them to require the banks report some of the sex disaggregated information. But it's amazing to me how also some industries, we just put out a report 3 weeks ago called She for Shield, which is the first major report that we did with an insurance company. And it's incredible in working with this major insurance company, AXA, and also with Accenture, how little they know their own, first of all, talent base in terms of their employees, but also their market, who their market is, and the needs of male and female consumers in these markets. And this is the first ever report on this kind of the insurance needs, as well as labor force and insurance agents in 10 emerging market economies. Nobody's ever done that before. So I think that's actually a frontier area of research. I think on the asset agenda, it's really important to make some of the intangibles visible. Intangibles here that I think matter are things like time use, where we have some data, but it's an area that we need to do more on. And I think when you make more of the kinds of intangible stuff visible, you can understand the trade-offs that individuals or households make across different types of assets in response to coping strategies or other kinds of things. The final thing I want to say is I think you asked a really provocative question about in the 20 years of research, are there any missed opportunities, and has gender research taken wing? And I think the answer to that is we may have probably have had missed opportunities. I was involved with a group of people on issues on the macroeconomic side. We've been heavily focused on micro and meso issues, and I think the macroeconomic issues have been, and the level of fiscal policy, taxation expenditure has been something where we need more rigor. The other thing that I think we're starting to now, and it's great that we see it, but I think it was somewhat of a missed opportunity, is the field of impact evaluation from a gender perspective has been very mushy. And I started writing about this in the 90s and the early 2000s, and it's not just the impact of interventions on males and females, but by doing design of interventions differently in terms of integrated services or other kinds of things, what's the effect on overall outcomes that we care about, like food security or agricultural productivity, what's the difference that makes? And I think this is the frontier going forward. Impact evaluation is really critical, and we can engage in a discussion about whether it's random control designs or other things, but we really need to get away from a lot of the mushiness that's in the field. And as much as the data visibility is critical, if we don't have the evaluations of what works and what doesn't, we're not going to get far with the policymakers.
Thank you. Karen, Mark?
Thanks. So on the public-private partnerships, back when I worked here at IFPRI, we had a conference called Pro-Poor Public-Private Partnerships in Agricultural Research, P to the fifth power, AR. I somehow got the short straw that I had to make the record of the meeting. So the first day in the opening session, the private sector folks said, okay, CGIAR, you've got this huge collection of germplasm that should be on the table. And by the way, we're not putting any money on the table. Now let's talk. It went downhill from there. I'll leave that. On the intangible assets, I mean, I would say local knowledge is a large one of those. And just thinking about research I've done for IFPRI and Oxfam, so if you go to Ethiopia, they talk about the wax and the gold. And the Ferengis, if they're lucky, they might see the wax. They never see the gold underneath. I've also worked in Haiti for both IFPRI and Oxfam, and so you think you're real cool if you can speak French. Of course, 5% of the population speaks French. Once you speak Haitian Creole, all sorts of things open up to you. But most of the researchers and the expat NGO folks never get that far. On the taking wing question, Rajul, I can speak to you about how that's happened at Oxfam. So in order to do research, I have to have a terms of reference signed off. And there's a box that says, what's your gender analysis going to be? And if that's blank, the sign-off is very unlikely.
Agnes, final words.
Um, I'm a person who tends not to look back. I don't like to think about missed opportunities. So I like to think, I want to look forward and see where the opportunities are. But maybe I will look back a little bit. I think two things. One is a lesson I learned from working with nutritionists. I think that before we started working with nutritionists, our intra-household analysis, our focus on individual outcomes was very limited because we weren't looking at people. But malnutrition happens at an individual basis. Individual people are hungry. Households are not hungry. Persons are hungry. So once we started working with a nutritionist, I started to acquire the tools that I needed to work on gender more scientifically, to do impact evaluations, focusing on individuals more scientifically. And I think that if we had more, if social scientists and biophysical scientists and biological scientists work together more, we might also be able to come up with better solutions to gender disparities. The other thing that I have noticed, and perhaps this is a missed opportunity, is that the age segmentation in our target groups has often caused us to miss certain things, the age and gender segregation. So, for example, there's almost like a cottage industry which focuses on adolescent girls. There's a cottage industry that focuses on youth. Not looking at, there might be an overlap. I mean, among these youth, certainly there are girls among these youth. There are also adolescent boys. And I think that we need to be looking at this sort of more comprehensively. In terms of the intangibles, I think that once we start looking at time use, which is often mentioned as a constraint for women, we will see the constraints to their investment of some of the intangible things that we think are important, like social capital or political capital. Investing in your networks, these all need time, and nobody can do everything at the same time. But has the gender research community taken wing? It has certainly flourished over the past 20 years. What else does it need to flourish? It needs support. It needs being willing to take risks. It needs people working together more. I can make a long list, but I think, as long as we have interesting research questions, and I'm sure there are more questions to ask, and as long as we get some commitment to fund these interesting experiments for programs, I think we have a lot to do.
And on that happy note, a lot to do. Thank you very much for this wonderful panel. And I would say that October 14, 2035, maybe Beijing plus 40. Thank you very much. Please join me. Appreciate it.
Thank you.